the folded paper pressed against Mary Kendrick's palm like a burning coal, and when she looked up into Seth Abbott's gray eyes, she saw something she had never once expected to find in this town full of liars and swindlers. She saw honesty. He leaned close, so close she could smell the dust and leather of him, the faint scent of gun oil and something warmer beneath that, something almost like cedar. His voice dropped to barely more than a breath, and the words he whispered cut straight through the noise of the crowded courthouse hallway like a blade through silk. "Someone forged the original," he said, "and I can prove it." Mary's fingers tightened around the deed. Her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs that she was certain the lawyer standing 10 feet away could hear it. Elias Crane, that lawyer, stood with his thumbs in his vest pockets and a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his narrow face, the kind of smile that had been perfectly constructed over years of watching people lose everything they had. He was watching her now, waiting. She had been about to sign. 20 minutes ago she had walked into the Harlan County Courthouse in Redemption, Texas, in the late summer of 1882, clutching the papers her father's lawyer had sent from Missouri, intending to do the only sensible thing a 26-year-old woman with no money, no husband, and no allies could do when the most powerful man in 3 counties had decided to swallow her land whole. She had been intending to surrender. Then the deputy had stepped out of the shadows beside the bulletin board near the back stairwell, a tall, quiet man she had seen exactly 4 times since arriving in Redemption 2 weeks prior, a man who spoke rarely and noticed everything, and he had pressed that folded deed into her hand and changed everything. Mary forced herself to breathe. She forced herself to look away from Seth Abbott's eyes before Crane noticed the exchange, and she turned her gaze to the high-pressed tin ceiling above her as though she were simply steadying her nerves. Her mind was racing. The land was 22 acres on the eastern edge of the Pecos River Basin, a modest stretch of good grass and reliable water that her father, Robert Kendrick, had filed on in 1871 and worked until consumption took him 3 months ago. She had ridden 2 days and taken a train for 6 more to get here and claim what was hers. And within 48 hours of her arrival, the threats had begun. First it was Harlan Voss himself, the cattle baron who owned everything in Redemption that was worth owning, sending his man with a low offer. Then a higher one. Then a visit in the night to the boarding house where she was staying, a shadowy figure who left a note slipped under her door that read simply, "Take the money and leave while you are still able to leave." She had not left. She was a Kendrick, and Kendricks did not fold without a fight. But the fight had been costing her ground every single day, because someone had filed a competing deed at the county records office, a deed that predated her father's claim by 2 full years, a deed bearing a signature that looked enough like Robert Kendrick's to pass cursory inspection, and it named Harlan Voss as the rightful owner of the 22 acres by virtue of a sale her father had allegedly completed in 1869, before he ever filed, before he ever broke a single inch of that ground. Her father had never sold that land. She knew it in her blood and in her bones. He had never mentioned a prior claim, had never hinted at a sale, had written to her as recently as 6 months before his death about the spring calves, and the way the river ran high and silver in the morning light. A man did not write that way about land he had already surrendered. But knowing and proving were 2 very different animals in Harlan County in 1882, especially when the county judge had been Harlan Voss's hunting companion for the better part of a decade. She had found herself standing in that courthouse hallway, beaten down by 2 weeks of dead ends and cold stares and doors closing quietly in her face, and she had been about to sign the papers that would give Voss the land for a settlement fee that barely covered her train fare home. She had been about to give up. And then Seth Abbott had changed everything. She had first noticed Seth Abbott on the morning of her 3rd day in Redemption. She had been sitting at the counter of the Meridian Cafe on Main Street, eating eggs and trying to read the Harlan County Register for any mention of her father's estate, when she became aware of someone watching her. not the hungry, appraising way that several of the town's men had watched her since her arrival, which she had learned to ignore with the particular cold discipline that a woman traveling alone in West Texas had to develop fast. This was different. It was careful, almost scholarly. She had looked up and found a man leaning against the doorframe of the sheriff's office directly across the dusty street, arms folded, hat brim low. He wore a deputy's star on his chest, but he wore it the way some men wore a scar, like it was simply a fact of him rather than a decoration. He was not smiling. He was not making any gestures of approach. He was simply watching, the way a man watches something he is trying to understand. She had held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to make a point, and then returned to her newspaper. The second time she had seen him was at the post office, where he had been sorting through a pile of wanted circulars with the methodical patience of a man who had done the same thing 1,000 times. He had not looked up when she came in, but when she left, she had the distinct feeling that he had heard and catalogued every word of her conversation with the postmaster about where she might find a land surveyor willing to work on her side of the dispute. The third time was outside the records office, late on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat had finally begun to relent, and the shadows from the livery stable stretched long and gold across the street. She had been leaving after another fruitless hour with the county's land ledgers, and he had been sitting on the bench outside the hardware store 2 doors down, apparently doing nothing at all. But as she passed, he had said, without looking up from the hat in his hands that he appeared to be inspecting for damage, "The ledger for 1869 has had a page rebound. Front staff won't tell you that, but it has." She had stopped. She had looked at him fully then, this quiet man with the measuring gray eyes and the economy of movement that reminded her of a hawk sitting absolutely still on a fence post, saving everything for the moment that mattered. "How do you know that?" she had asked. "Because I looked," he said, and that was all. He had put his hat back on and walked away down the boardwalk toward the south end of town. She had gone back into the records office the next morning and asked specifically to examine the 1869 ledger. And the clerk, a fidgety young man named Hodges who smelled of ink and anxiety, had told her that the 1869 ledger was currently being reviewed for routine maintenance and was unavailable. That was enough to tell her that Seth Abbott was not simply an idle observer. He was watching the same machinery she was fighting against, and he had seen something that mattered. The fourth time she saw him was today, when his hand had found hers in that courthouse hallway and pressed the deed into her palm with the urgency of a man passing a message through enemy lines. Now she stood with the deed in her hand, and Elias Crane's patient smile aimed at her from across the hall, and she had to make a decision in the next 30 seconds that would determine whether she walked out of this courthouse with her father's land or with nothing. She turned slightly, just enough to bring Seth Abbott into her peripheral vision, and she murmured, "When?" "Tonight," he said. "The boarding house, after 9. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then she crossed the hallway toward Elias Crane with her chin up and her hands steady, and she told him that she was going to need more time to review the settlement terms. Crane's smile did not change in any visible way, but something behind it went cold. "Miss Kendrick," he said, "Mr. Voss has been extraordinarily patient." "Then a few more days should present no hardship," she said, and walked past him toward the courthouse door. The Texas heat hit her like a wall the moment she stepped outside. Redemption in August was a punishment of a town, the air dry as old paper and hot enough to shimmer above the hard-packed street. The town itself was neither large nor small by the standards of the 1880s Texas frontier, a main street of perhaps a dozen substantial buildings, a saloon, a general store, a hotel, the Meridian Cafe, a bank, a land office, and various smaller structures pressing in around them like poor relations at a family table. Beyond the last building on either end of Main Street, the flat brown land stretched away to the horizon under a sky so blue and enormous it was almost aggressive. Mary walked back toward Mrs. Hollowell's boarding house, the deed still folded in her hand, her mind working fast. She needed to think. She needed to be somewhere that Crane's eyes could not follow, and somewhere that Harlan Voss's various paid informants, whom she had begun to identify around the town with a grim and growing certainty, were not positioned to report her reactions. Mrs. Hollowell's was a two-story frame house on the quieter end of 2nd Street, clean and respectable, the kind of establishment where a woman alone could stay without comment. Mrs. Hollowell herself was a robust widow of 50 with red cheeks and strong opinions about the importance of breakfast, and she had taken a quiet liking to Mary in the way that capable women sometimes recognized each other. Mary reached her room, locked the door, sat down on the edge of the narrow bed, and unfolded the deed. It was a land deed, clearly, the form and language familiar to her from her father's papers. It named the property in the same terms as her father's filed claim, 22 acres along the east bank of the Pecos Basin tributary, known locally as Callum Creek, a name she recognized from her father's letters with a sharp pang of grief. The deed bore a date of March 14, 1869, and the signature that sprawled across the bottom was a credible imitation of Robert Kendrick's hand, not perfect. A careful person looking closely would find the differences, but close enough to convince a judge who was already inclined to be convinced. But Seth Abbott had told her someone had forged it, and he had told her he could prove it. She turned the paper over. On the back, in small, careful handwriting, in pencil so light it was barely visible, were 8 words. Compare the notary seal to the stamp register. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she folded the deed back up, tucked it into the inside pocket of her traveling jacket, lay back on the bed, and stared at the ceiling while she waited for night to fall. The wait was 4 hours, and they were among the longest 4 hours of her life. She went down to supper when Mrs. Hollowell called it, sat at the table with 2 traveling salesmen and a schoolteacher passing through on his way to a posting in El Paso, ate the beef stew without tasting it, made the appropriate responses to the appropriate conversational openings, and returned to her room as soon as was politely possible. She sat at the small writing desk by the window and wrote a letter to her mother in Missouri, careful and specific, detailing everything she knew about the forged deed and the land dispute and naming Harlan Voss and Elias Crane explicitly. She folded it and addressed it and left it on the desk. If anything happened to her, the letter would be found and sent. She had learned, since arriving in Redemption, to think in those terms. At 9:15 there was a soft knock at her door, 3 short and 2 long, a pattern she had not told anyone about, which meant that Seth Abbott had either been watching and had deduced the pattern she used herself, or he was simply the kind of man who knocked in a way that was clearly not accidental. Either way, she opened the door. He stood in the hallway, hat in hand, and he was somehow quieter inside the building than he had been outside it. The way some large, careful animals are actually less alarming in an enclosed space because their control becomes more visible. He was taller than she had fully registered in their previous exchanges, perhaps 6 feet, lean without being thin, with the kind of build that came from years of physical work rather than from youth. She estimated he was somewhere in his early 30s, perhaps 32 or 33, with brown hair that was sun-lightened at the temples and a jaw that had not been shaved today. "You read the note," he said. It was not a question. "The notary seal," she said, stepping back to let him in. "Come in before someone sees you." He came in and she closed the door and turned up the lamp on the desk. He set his hat on the chair and stood near the window, which he checked first, looking down at 2nd Street below before pulling the curtain partially across. "The deed Voss filed as evidence has a notary seal from a Charles Briggs, Notary Public, Harlan County," he said, his voice low and precise. Briggs was a real notary, operated in Redemption from 1867 to 1874, died in 74. Nobody's checked his stamp register because it's not at the courthouse. I found it. Mary felt the blood in her veins moving faster. "Where?" "At the records annex in Millhaven," he said. Millhaven's the county seat before redemption got big enough to take that over in 1876. When they transferred the county records, some of the older supporting documents went into a storage room at the Millhaven town clerk's office. Nobody's touched them in years. I had business there last month on an unrelated matter, and I found Briggs's stamp register in a box that also contained his appointment ledger and about 50 years of water rights filings. And Mary's voice was barely a breath. Charles Briggs recorded every document he notarized. Every single one, date, parties involved, a brief description. It was his habit. Meticulous man. Seth's gray eyes were steady on her face. There is no record in his stamp register of any land transaction between Robert Kendrick and Harlan Voss or any agent of Harlan Voss in 1869. Not in 1869. Not in any year. The silence in the small room was enormous. Mary pressed her hand flat against the desk surface, needing the solidity of it. "That's the proof," she said. "That's the foundation of the proof," he said. "We also need to show that the notary seal on the forged deed is inconsistent with the seals Briggs used in 1869. His stamp wore down. The impression changed over the years. I've compared it against 4 other documents he authenticated in 1869, actual authenticated documents from that period, and the impression doesn't match. The seal on the document Voss filed is too sharp. It matches Briggs's seal from 1871 or 1872, not 1869. Mary stared at him. "How long have you been building this?" Something shifted in his expression, subtle like a door opening a crack. "Long enough." "That's not an answer." 3 months, he said. "I started looking when your father died. I knew Voss would move on the property the moment the estate was unsettled. I've been waiting for you to get here." He paused. "I'm sorry about your father." The directness of that last sentence, unadorned and genuine, hit her somewhere soft and unexpected. She turned away slightly, not because she was going to cry, but because she did not want him to see how close to the surface everything was. "He was a good man," she said. "I know, I met him twice. He came to town for supplies. He was the kind of man who said good morning to everyone, including the people that other people didn't bother with." She turned back. "You knew him." "Not well. But I noticed him." A pause. "I noticed things." That slight, dry understatement in those last 3 words was so precisely calibrated that Mary, in spite of everything, felt the corner of her mouth want to move. She kept it still. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? You're a deputy in this county. Voss owns half of what breathes in this county. Helping me is not something that carries any benefit for you, and it carries considerable risk." Seth Abbott was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hat on the chair, then back at her. "Because it's wrong," he said. "What Voss is doing is theft dressed up in legal clothing, and I took an oath to uphold the law in this county. And the law says that a man cannot steal another man's land just because he has the money to hire someone to falsify the paperwork. Your father built something honest on honest ground, and Voss wants to swallow it because it borders his north range and because he can. And because in this county the word can and the word allowed have gotten confused for too long." She watched him as he spoke. There was no heat in his voice, no anger, just the flat gravity of a man stating something he had decided long ago and would not be moved from. "You should know," she said carefully, "that going against Voss in this county could cost you your job. Possibly more." "Yes," he said simply, "and you're doing it anyway." "Yes. Why tell me now? Why not go directly to a judge in another county? Why involve me?" "Because it's your land," he said, as though that answered everything. And perhaps it did. She held his gaze and felt something she had not felt since arriving in this town, which was the sensation of not being entirely alone. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" What they did over the next several days was the most careful and methodical work Mary had ever participated in, and she had grown up watching her father file cattle records with the precision of an accountant, so she had a standard of reference. Seth Abbott moved through the world with a deliberateness that was almost hypnotic to observe. Nothing wasted, nothing hurried. each step considered before it was taken. The first task was to get access to the stamp register without alerting Voss or Crane or any of the half-dozen people in Redemption who reported to one or both of them. Seth arranged for Mary to ride with him to Millhaven, a distance of roughly 18 miles east, on the pretense of visiting the land surveyor's office there to discuss a boundary assessment, a perfectly reasonable thing for a woman in a land dispute to do. Nobody who saw them leave on that Wednesday morning, Mary on the bay mare she had hired from the livery and Seth on his own horse, a solid gray gelding he called nothing in particular, would have found cause for comment beyond the inevitable small-town murmur about a woman riding with a man. The ride to Millhaven was the longest uninterrupted time she had spent in Seth Abbott's company, and she found herself paying attention to him in a way that was distinct from the focused, tactical attention she had been giving him since he first appeared in her peripheral awareness. She noticed the way he rode, easy and economical, the way he carried himself in the saddle as though horse and man were a single organism that had worked out their understanding long ago. She noticed that he pointed out a red-tailed hawk banking low over the brush flats west of the road, not with any particular sentiment, just a gesture, a shared observation, as though it would be a waste to have seen it and not mentioned it. She noticed that he asked her, somewhere around the midpoint of the ride, about her father. Not about the land or the estate or the legal situation, but about him, what kind of man he was, what he had built out there on the Callum Creek property, whether the house was still standing. "I haven't been out to the property yet," she said. "I've been afraid to. I didn't want to go out there and find it in bad shape and have it break my nerve right when I needed my nerve most." "That makes sense," he said. "Does it?" She glanced at him. "It feels like cowardice." "There's a difference between cowardice and strategy," he said. "A person can decide what they're ready to absorb and when. That's not running away. That's managing your resources." She thought about that. "My father would have liked you," she said. Seth looked at her then, a full look rather than the oblique observations he usually offered, and she saw something move through his expression, something that was not quite surprise and not quite pleasure but was in the territory of both. "I hope so," he said quietly. They reached Millhaven by mid-morning. The town was smaller than Redemption, quieter, the kind of place that had been passed over by the main current of progress, and had found a sort of settled dignity in that fact. The town clerk's office was a low stone building near the center of town, and the clerk himself, a man named Prentice, was elderly, courteous, and genuinely delighted by anyone who expressed interest in his archive, which he regarded as one of the great underappreciated collections of documentary history in the American Southwest. Seth had written ahead, establishing the pretext of reviewing old water rights filings for a survey matter, and Prentice led them without question to the back storage room, a cool, dim space stacked with flat wooden boxes and the particular papery silence of very old records. He left them alone with a lamp, and the understanding that they were not to rearrange anything they did not need to rearrange. Seth went directly to a specific box on the third shelf from the left, fourth from the end, with the certainty of someone who had already made this journey, and memorized the precise coordinates of what he found. He lifted the box down and set it on the work table in the center of the room. Mary leaned over the table beside him as he opened it. The stamp register was a bound notebook, its cover worn to a pale gray-brown, the spine cracked but intact. Seth opened it to a specific page marked with a strip of paper he had left on his previous visit. The entries were small, careful, in an old-fashioned hand that had the slight tremor of a man writing daily over many years, the pen's path always clear and purposeful despite that tremor. They worked through the 1869 entries together, Mary reading while Seth noted the dates and parties. There was no entry for any transaction involving Robert Kendrick in 1869. No land sale, no transfer, no document of any kind bearing her father's name. "There," Seth said, pointing to a blank stretch in the register. March 14, 1869, the day of the alleged sale. Briggs notarized a water rights assignment between two ranchers named Colton and Felix, and then nothing else for 4 days. He would have entered the Kendrick-Voss transaction if it had been real, Mary said. Without question, look at this. He turned back several pages showing her entries from 1868. He recorded everything: bill of sale for a mule, an affidavit of residence. He recorded a document attesting to the character of a minister applying for a church lot. He notarized everything people brought him, and he recorded everything he notarized. The absence of a Kendrick entry is not coincidence. And the seal impression, Mary said. You mentioned the seal impression. Seth reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Inside the envelope was a series of careful ink rubbings he had made from the Briggs stamp impressions on verified 1869 documents, transferred to thin paper with the kind of delicate, patient precision that Mary was increasingly recognizing as simply Seth Abbott's way of doing things. He laid them beside the forged deed, and they compared the impressions in the lamplight. The difference was visible. Not dramatic, not immediately obvious to an untrained eye, but once you knew what you were looking at, it was there. The seal on the forged deed had a marginally crisper impression at the outer ring, a fine detail of the stamp that would have worn down by 1869, in a stamp that had been in continuous use since 1867, a detail that would have been restored to something closer to its original state by 1871 or 1872, when the stamp was apparently refinished or replaced. Someone used the wrong year's impression, Mary said. She could hear her own voice sounding strange, thin with the pressure of understanding what they were looking at. Whoever made the forgery got their hands on Briggs's stamp in 1871 or 1872 and backdated the document to 1869, but they didn't account for the wear. Or they didn't know enough to account for it, Seth said. It's a sophisticated forgery in most respects. The handwriting on the signature, the language of the deed itself, the formatting. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, but they slipped on the seal. Who did this? Mary asked. Who actually made the forgery? Not Voss. He wouldn't have done it himself. No, Seth said. Voss uses a man, a lawyer before he was disbarred in Austin in 1878 for document fraud, name of Henry Pell. He's been in Harlan County for about 4 years now, nominally working as a land surveyor. But his real occupation, as near as I can tell, is providing Voss with whatever legal or semi-legal service is required. Can we prove that Pell made this specific document? Seth was quiet for a moment. That's harder. We can prove the document is fraudulent. We can't necessarily prove who made it without more evidence. But if we can prove the document is fraudulent, the burden shifts. The question becomes not whether your father sold the land, but who created a fraudulent document claiming he did. Mary straightened up and looked at him in the lamp's warm circle of light. They were standing close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him beside her in the cool room, and she thought about the distance between where they had been 2 weeks ago and where they stood now. She arriving alone and besieged in a town that had been arranged against her, and he stepping quietly out of the shadow with the key to the lock. "Thank you," she said. She meant it with her whole self, everything that had been compressed and pressurized and exhausted and grieving for the last months. She put all of it into those 2 words. Seth looked at her with that careful, assessing look she was becoming familiar with. Then he looked away. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still have to find a judge willing to hear this." That problem was the next mountain. A judge willing to hear a challenge to a claim that Harlan Voss had personally endorsed, in a county where Voss's influence reached into nearly every institutional corner, was not a resource easily located. Seth had thought about this too. The Texas District Court had jurisdiction over land matters in Harlan County, but the district judge, a man named Whitmore, had been appointed with Voss's vocal endorsement and was known to be a regular guest at Voss's ranch. The appeals court in Austin was theoretically accessible, but the process was slow and expensive, and Mary did not have the funds to sustain a prolonged legal battle, which Voss absolutely knew and was certainly counting on. What Seth Abbott had found, through careful research and the particular kind of lateral thinking that had clearly been sustaining his effort for 3 months, was a different avenue entirely. The Federal Land Office in Texas had oversight authority over original land filings made under the Homestead Act or the preemption claims process. Her father had filed his original claim under the preemption process in 1871, which meant that the original filing was a federal record, which meant that a federal land commissioner had jurisdiction to review competing claims that challenged the validity of a federal filing. And the federal land commissioner for Central and Western Texas in 1882 was a man named James Ackaffer, appointed by the General Land Office in Washington, who was known in legal circles as a meticulous and genuinely incorruptible administrator, a man who had no existing relationship with Harlan Voss, no history in Harlan County, and no patience whatsoever for the kind of document manipulation that Seth Abbott had just spent 3 months methodically documenting. The problem was that Ackaffer was based in San Antonio, and petitioning his office required a formal written submission with supporting documentation, which would take time, and in that time, Voss and Crane could potentially move to have the county court finalize their competing claim through a fast-tracked hearing that would create a legal complication, even if the federal commissioner subsequently sided with Mary. Speed, therefore, was now the critical variable. They spent 3 hours in that cool room in the Millhaven town clerk's office, with Prentice occasionally drifting past the door with an expression of mild and benevolent interest, and they assembled a documentary record that Seth had been building in pieces and that now, brought together, formed something coherent and powerful. The stamp register, the ink rubbings, a certified copy of the original 1871 preemption, filing that Mary had brought from Missouri with her father's papers, bearing the GLO seal. A letter Seth had obtained from another county records clerk, not in Harlan County, confirming the standard practice and format of notarized land transactions in Texas in the 1860s and early 1870s, which the forged document deviated from in 2 small but documentable ways. Seth drafted the petition to Commissioner Ackaffer's office in long, clean sentences that had a lawyer's precision without the obscuring fog that some lawyers wrapped their language in. Mary read each paragraph as he wrote it and suggested 3 changes, all of which Seth accepted without argument, and 2 of which he improved upon with a revision that kept her intent while sharpening the language. They worked together with the smooth efficiency of people who had somehow already learned each other's minds, which struck Mary as remarkable given how short their actual acquaintance was. But then, she thought, they had both been thinking about this same problem for months, she from one direction and he from another, and they had arrived at the same place. When the petition was drafted and the supporting documents were organized into a logical sequence, they packaged everything carefully and went a fine Prentice to arrange certified copies of the stamp register pages and the letter of verification regarding the documents. Prentice, who had been unobtrusively present throughout, and who turned out to have followed the situation with the focused attention of a man who found the machinations of Harlan Voss to be a source of sustained personal outrage, certified everything they needed without hesitation and without charge, stating firmly that his records were public property, and that any certified copy issued from his office in support of a legitimate legal proceeding was a matter of civic duty. They rode back to Redemption in the late afternoon, with the sun going low and orange behind them, and the long shadows of their horses stretched east across the brush flats. Mary rode beside Seth, and for a long stretch of the journey neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had just done something significant together and were sitting with the weight of it. It was Seth who finally broke it. "We'll need to get the package to San Antonio without going through the county post office," he said. There are people watching the post office. I noticed, Mary said. The man Hodges at the records office, for one. And the woman who runs the telegraph office. Seth glanced at her. You've been watching. You are not the only one who notices things. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Almost. It was a restrained face, Seth Abbott's, not cold but guarded, with the guardedness of a man who had learned at some point that the world did not reward openness with openness in return. But the almost smile, fleeting as it was, changed his whole expression, and Mary found herself wanting to see it again. We can use the postal agent in Millhaven, he said. Prentice will allow it. The package goes direct to San Antonio, marked for the land commissioner's office, and Voss has no reach in Millhaven. Can Okafor move fast enough? He can issue a temporary injunction against any county court proceedings while the federal review is pending, Seth said. That's what we need. Not a final ruling yet, just the injunction to stop Crane from fast-tracking the county hearing. If we can get that, we buy time. And then we present the evidence and Okafor rules on the validity of the competing claim. He paused. I believe he'll rule in your favor. The evidence is substantial, but not certain. Nothing in law is certain, he said, but this is as close as I've seen. They rode the rest of the way in that companionable quiet, and Mary noticed that she had stopped feeling afraid. Not because the danger had diminished. Voss was still Voss, and the stakes were still enormous, but because she was no longer alone in the middle of it. That shift, from isolated and besieged to standing beside someone who was standing with her by choice and by conviction, was doing something to her interior landscape that she was not quite ready to name. The package was sent from Millhaven the following morning, Thursday, with Seth riding back alone before dawn, while Mary remained at Mrs. Hollowell's and spent the day doing the useful work of being visibly and apparently resigned, attending a meeting with Crane at his office, and telling him she was still considering the settlement, giving no sign that anything had changed. Crane was smooth and reasonable and entirely terrible, and sitting across the desk from him while he discussed acreage values in the tone of a man doing her a generous favor required every scrap of composure she possessed. When she left Crane's office, she walked directly to the Meridian Cafe and sat down and ordered coffee and allowed herself, for exactly 5 minutes, to feel everything she had been suppressing. The fury of it, the grief underneath the fury. The particular degradation of sitting across from a man who was working to steal from her father's memory, and having to smile and nod, and play the part of a woman wavering toward surrender. She was halfway through her coffee when she heard the door open and looked up and saw Seth Abbott coming in. He had clearly ridden hard and recently, dust on his jacket, and his hat carrying that particular look of a hat worn low against wind. He sat down across from her without asking, and she poured him a cup from the pot the waitress had left. It's sent, he said. How long? If Okafor is in his office and the petition is clear enough, 3 days for a response by telegraph. A week at most before we'd see a written order. Crane wants an answer by Monday. Seth wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and thought for a moment. Then we need to stall him past Monday without tipping our hand. I can do that, Mary said. I've been playing that part for 2 weeks. A few more days won't break me. He looked at her across the table, and she saw in his face something that she recognized as a form of admiration, though with Seth Abbott it was expressed so quietly that it was almost invisible, present only in the particular quality of his attention. You've handled this well, he said. Most people coming into a situation like this alone, outnumbered in unfamiliar territory, they'd have taken the settlement by day 3. My father didn't raise someone who would take the settlement by day 3. No, Seth said. Clearly not. He turned his cup in his hands. Tell me about him, your father, when you're ready, she told him. There, in the morning light at the Meridian Cafe with the sounds of Redemption's Main Street moving around them, she told him about Robert Kendrick of Missouri, and then of West Texas, a man who had come west at 35 with $160, and a plan that most people told him was foolish, and who had built, over 11 years, something that sustained him and gave him the particular dignity of a man who had made something real with his own hands. She told Seth about her father's letters, about the spring calves and the silver river and the way he described his land in the mornings, and she heard her own voice going soft in the middle of it and did not try to harden it. Seth listened the way he did everything, with total attention and no performance of listening. He did not interject or redirect. He simply heard her. "He wrote well," she said. "Better than you'd expect. He'd had some schooling and he took it seriously. He read every book he could get his hands on." "What kind of books?" "History, mostly, military history, and Shakespeare. He was ridiculous about Shakespeare. He could quote entire speeches from memory, and he would, at the most unexpected moments. You'd ask him about the weather and he'd end up on the nature of clouds in King Lear." Seth's almost smile appeared again, and this time it stayed a half-second longer before it retreated. "That sounds like a man worth knowing," he said. "It sounds exactly like him," Mary said, and felt the grief move through her cleanly, as grief does when you speak about someone honestly to someone who is genuinely listening. The days that followed had the quality of suspended animation, of waiting for a thing you know is coming and cannot hurry. Mary maintained her pretense of wavering consideration with Crane, meeting with him on Friday and again, briefly, on Saturday, each time giving him just enough apparent ambivalence to prevent him from demanding an immediate answer. She was very good at this, she discovered. Growing up as the daughter of a stubborn and particular man had given her an internal reservoir of steadiness she had not fully known was there. Seth continued his regular duties as deputy, which he performed with exactly the same thoroughness and quiet discipline he brought to everything, and which provided him with a cover of normalcy that would have been difficult to fabricate. He was not a demonstrative man in the performance of his work. He did not swagger or grandstand. He walked his beats, resolved disputes, kept the peace on the nights when the saloon crowd got loud, and was, from all external appearances, a man whose entire attention was on the daily business of a deputy's life. But he came to the boarding house on Friday evening, via the back entrance that Mrs. Hollowell showed him without being asked, displaying a pragmatic understanding of clandestine necessity that Mary found both reassuring and somewhat hilarious, and they sat at the small table in the back parlor and talked through every variable of the situation again, making sure nothing had shifted, making sure their plan still held. It was during this second meeting in the domestic quiet of Mrs. Hollowell's back parlor that Mary first allowed herself to fully notice what was happening between them. Not just the professional alliance, not just the mutual respect and the shared purpose, but the thing underneath those things, the way a conversation with Seth Abbott felt both unusually safe and unusually alive, the way she was aware of the exact distance between them at all times, the way she found herself watching his hands when he sorted through papers, those steady, careful hands that moved with the same economy as everything else about him. She did not say any of this. There were more immediate things to attend to. But she filed it in a particular internal compartment and closed the door gently, the way you set down something fragile in a safe place and note where you've put it for later. On Sunday afternoon, sitting in her room writing another letter to her mother, she heard a commotion from the direction of Main Street, raised voices, and the sound of horses moving fast. She went to her window and saw a rider coming in from the east direction at speed, pulling up in front of the sheriff's office. She watched Seth emerge from the office and speak with the rider. From her angle she could see Seth's face clearly, and what she saw in it was controlled alertness, a man receiving significant information and processing it without spilling any of it visibly. She was downstairs and at the back door 15 minutes later when Seth knocked. "Ackeffer's office responded," he said, the moment she opened the door. "The telegraph came through the Millhaven office. I had Prentice forward it to me through a roundabout. And the commissioner has issued a temporary injunction against any county court proceedings regarding the Kendrick land claim pending federal review. The formal order is coming by express courier and will arrive Tuesday or Wednesday." He paused. He also sent word that he finds the documentation of the forged seal to be, in his phrase, compelling and warranting immediate investigation. Mary felt her knees go briefly unreliable. She put one hand on the doorframe. "It worked," she said. "Yes," Seth said. He was watching her with that careful attention, and this time, there in the shadow of the doorway with the late Sunday afternoon light making long gold lanes through the cottonwood trees in Mrs. Hollowell's backyard, his expression was not guarded. It was something else. Something that looked, she thought, like the face of a man watching something he did not quite believe he was allowed to hope for. "Seth," she said, and the use of his first name, which she had not done before this moment, made something shift in the air between them, something neither of them addressed directly but both of them felt. "Mary," he said, equally quiet, and that was all that happened, which was also somehow everything that happened. Monday morning she went to Crane's office and told him she was not signing. She was very calm about it. She sat across his desk and told him that she had reason to believe the competing deed filed by Harlan Voss was not valid, and that she had referred the matter to the Federal Land Commissioner's office and was prepared to pursue the matter through that channel. Crane's response was instructive. He did not raise his voice or show any visible anger. He became very, very still. The smile did not return. He looked at her with the expressionless focus of a man who has just discovered that the chess match he thought was nearly won is suddenly more complicated than he had believed. "That would be a significant decision," he said carefully. "Yes," she said pleasantly, "it would. Mr. Voss's patience has limits, Miss Kendrick." "I have no doubt," she said. "Please convey my respects." She walked out of his office and down the boardwalk and into the August heat and felt, for the first time since her father had died, like herself. Like the person she was underneath the grief and the fear and the exhaustion of fighting alone. A woman who was her father's daughter in every important respect, and who was not afraid. What followed Crane's meeting with Voss was swift and somewhat alarming, but ultimately not unpredicted. On Monday evening, Seth came to find Mary at the boarding house with news that Henry Pell, Voss's document man, had left Redemption in some haste during the afternoon, seen riding south with 2 bags on his horse. The departure of the man most likely responsible for creating the forged deed, 3 days after a federal inquiry had been opened, was its own kind of confession. "Voss will be recalculating," Seth said. "Pell leaving is a problem for him. He loses his primary legal fixer at exactly the moment he needs one." "Will Voss come after us directly?" Mary asked. She kept her voice neutral, but the question was not. Seth considered it honestly. He might apply pressure. He has men who are loyal to his money rather than to any law, but a man like Voss is primarily a businessman, and a businessman calculates odds. Right now the odds of a direct confrontation making his situation worse rather than better are significant. The federal inquiry is open. The injunction is filed. Any action he takes against you or against me becomes evidence of consciousness of guilt. So we wait. We wait for the commissioner's formal order, and then we prepare our case for the federal review, Seth said. "In the meantime, I'll be close." That last 3 words were simple and direct, and carried a warmth that was more than professional. The Federal Land Commissioner's formal order arrived on Wednesday, delivered by an express rider from San Antonio, and it was everything the Telegraph had promised. The injunction against county court proceedings was formally in place. Commissioner Acaffer had also, in the body of the order, requested a formal written response from any party wishing to contest the validity of the claim, with a deadline of 30 days, after which the commissioner would conduct a review of all submitted evidence and issue a ruling. Elias Crane did file a response on behalf of Voss. It was smooth and argumentative and referenced legal precedents in the way that men who argue from a weak position use precedents to fill space and create the appearance of substance. Seth and Mary spent 3 evenings in the back parlor of Mrs. Hollowell's boarding house drafting their counter-submission, working by lamplight with the stamp register copies and the ink rubbings, and the signed statements from the Millhaven clerk's office spread across the table, building their argument piece by piece. It was during the second of these evenings that something broke open between them. They had been working for 2 hours, their chairs close together at the small table, and Mary had been reading aloud from a section of their draft submission while Seth made notes in the margin. She finished the paragraph and looked up to find him not writing but watching her, the pencil still in his hand, his attention entirely on her face. She did not look away. "You have a good mind for this," he said. The observation was genuine rather than flattering, the tone of a man acknowledging a fact. "My father taught me to read a document," she said. "He said a woman who could read a document was harder to cheat than a woman who couldn't. He was right." A pause. "He would be proud of what you're doing here." The grief moved through her again, but differently this time, not as something that needed to be controlled, but as something she could let pass through without being undone by it. "I hope so," she said. "I think I'm more like him than I knew. I had to come here to find that out." Seth set the pencil down. "What will you do?" "After, if we win this." "When we win this," she said with a firmness that made him almost smile again. "I'll stay. I want to see the land. I want to fix up the house if it needs it. I want to know what he built." She looked at Seth. "I don't have anything in Missouri that matters as much as what's here." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked down at the papers, and she saw him making some internal decision, working something out behind those careful gray eyes. "I've been in Redemption for 4 years," he said. "I came from Colorado originally, small town there called Graves Creek. I was a deputy there too. I came here because a friend was the sheriff and asked me to come. Sheriff Hale. He died of a fever the winter before last." She had not known this. She realized that she had accepted Seth Abbott as a fixed feature of Redemption without ever considering what had brought him here or what he had left behind. "You stayed after he died," she said. "There was still work to do," he said simply, "and nowhere I needed to be more." "Is that still true?" she asked. The question carried more weight than its surface phrasing. Seth looked at her then in a way that was direct and unhurried and entirely unguarded, and Mary Kendrick, who had learned to read what was in a room, read everything that was in his face clearly. "More than ever," he said. She did not answer that with words. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, just for a moment, just long enough to be unambiguous, and then she returned to the papers, and they continued to work, and the lamplight held them both in its warm circle while the Texas night settled around the boarding house, and everything between them had shifted permanently into something new. The 30-day submission period moved with an excruciating slowness that was somehow also very full. Seth and Mary saw each other nearly every day, sometimes on the pretext of the case, and sometimes not on any pretext at all, but simply because Redemption had a certain geography that made it natural for two people to encounter each other regularly if they were inclined to. And they were. They rode out to the Callum Creek property on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after the submission was filed. It was the first time Mary had been to her father's land, and she had steeled herself for it without quite knowing what she was steeling herself for. The property was reached by a dirt track that branched east off the main road south of town, winding through brush and mesquite for about 2 miles before the land opened into the basin where Callum Creek ran. A clear, quiet stream that even in the August heat maintained a respectful presence, bordered by cottonwood trees that were enormous and old and cast pools of moving shade across the grass beneath them. The house was a frame structure, modest but solid, built by her father's hands with the help of a neighbor over 2 winters. The windows were shuttered and the door was latched but intact. The kitchen garden beside the south wall had gone to weeds, but the fence around it still stood. A small barn 20 yards back was in good repair. Mary stood in front of the house for a long moment and did not say anything. Seth stood beside her, not speaking, not offering anything except his presence, which was what she needed. "It's real," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "I thought it might seem smaller than I imagined. It doesn't. It's exactly what I imagined from his letters." She walked to the front door and lifted the latch, which opened without difficulty, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, the furniture still in place under a fine layer of dust, the kitchen table with 2 chairs, her father's books on the shelf beside the fireplace, a collection that was smaller than she had imagined, but that made her breath catch because she recognized the spines from his descriptions. The Shakespeare was there, a well-worn copy with a cracked spine and folded page corners. She picked it up and held it against her chest for a moment, and felt Seth in the doorway behind her, a solid, warm presence that she was increasingly unable to imagine this landscape without. She turned around. He was leaning in the doorframe with the light at his back, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not expected to find himself and was quietly astonished by the fact of it. "Help me open the shutters," she said. "I want to see it with light in it." They went through the house together, unlatching and swinging open every shutter, and the August light poured in and touched every surface her father had touched, and the house came alive with it, and Mary Kendrick cried for the first time since her father died, standing in the middle of the main room with one hand over her mouth and the other holding Shakespeare. And Seth Abbott crossed the room to her, and she turned into him, and he put his arms around her and held her while she sobbed, and neither of them said a word. When she had finished crying and had stood back and wiped her face with the back of her hand and felt the particular lightness that comes after grief has been fully expressed rather than managed, she looked up at Seth and said, "Thank you for not saying anything." "You didn't need words," he said. "No," she said. "I needed exactly what you gave me." He looked at her with those unguarded eyes, and the something that had been building and building between them for weeks was very close to the surface now, barely contained by the practical matters they had been using to navigate their connection toward a place where they could say what was actually true. Seth reached out and touched her cheek with the back of 2 fingers, just a brief contact, gentle and wondering. She leaned into it fractionally and watched him understand what that meant. "When this is over," he said. It was the beginning of a sentence he did not quite complete. "When it's over," she agreed. She understood him perfectly. They rode back to Redemption in the late morning, and the ride had a different quality than any of the rides before, a warmth and a closeness that had no name yet, but that neither of them was trying to deny. Commissioner Acaffer's final ruling arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-September, 34 days after the submission period had opened. Seth received word by telegraph from Millhaven and came to the boarding house before breakfast, and Mary met him at the front door and saw in his face, before he said a word, that the news was what they had worked toward. "He ruled for you," Seth said. She felt the words settle through her like warm water. "Completely, completely." He invalidated the competing claims, citing fraudulent documentation, specifically the notary seal discrepancy, and the absence of any corresponding entry in the stamp register. He ordered the county to expunge the fraudulent deed from the records and affirmed your father's 1871 preemption claim as the valid and controlling title. Seth paused. He also referred the matter of the fraudulent deed to the state attorney's office in Austin for potential criminal investigation. That last part, the referral to the attorney's office, landed with a particular satisfaction that was not just about vindication. It was about the fact that what had been done to her father's memory, the attempt to rewrite his honest life with a forged signature, would not simply be administratively corrected and forgotten. Someone would be held accountable. "Voss?" Mary asked. Voss is protected somewhat by the layer of deniability that Pell provided, and Pell is gone. But Voss's reputation has taken a significant blow. The ruling is a public record and people in this county are already talking. Seth's expression was thoughtful. Powerful men who have been used to operating without accountability sometimes recalibrate when they find that the accounting has arrived after all. Mary took a breath of the clean morning air. "I own my father's land," she said. "You own it," Seth said firmly. She looked at him, this quiet man who had stepped out of the shadows 8 weeks ago and changed everything. who had spent 3 months building a case out of patience and principle before she had even arrived, who had given her his professional risk and his personal attention and his steady presence through every hard day of the fight. And she thought about what she had told him on that Saturday in her father's house, about having nothing in Missouri that mattered as much as what was here. She had not only been talking about the land. "Seth," she said. "Mary," he said, "I have a question and I would like you to answer it directly." "Always," he said. "When you are standing in my father's house, do you feel like you're somewhere you belong?" He looked at her for a long moment, everything in his face open and still, the guardedness she had first noticed in him present but thin now, present the way old habits are present even when you have genuinely moved past them. "Yes," he said, "I do." "So do I," she said, "and I believe that belongs to more than just the land." He stepped forward, and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her, it was exactly what she would have expected from Seth Abbott, deliberate and certain, and entirely committed once undertaken. His hands on her face as though she were something extraordinarily valuable that he had been careful with for a very long time, and was only now allowing himself to hold properly. When they separated, she was breathing faster and his eyes were warm and very close, and she thought with a kind of stunned clarity that she had not come to Redemption, Texas, to find this. And yet here it was, as inevitable as the shape of the land around them. "I realize," he said, "that we have not been exactly conventional in our acquaintance." "No," she said. "We went straight to the forged deeds and the federal land commissioner. I thought perhaps, when the legal situation is fully resolved and the land is properly recorded in your name and the criminal referral is submitted to Austin, I might ask you properly to allow me to court you." His voice was steady, but she could hear that this was not easy for him, the formal statement of something so significant, for a man as internally guarded as Seth Abbott. "You may consider the courting already underway," she told him, "and progressing very well." The smile that crossed his face this time was not almost a smile. It was a real, full, undisguised smile, the first she had seen from him in 2 months of observation, and it was worth every moment of the wait. The land was formally recorded in Mary Kendrick's name at the county records office in the last week of September 1882, with a new county clerk in attendance, because the previous clerk, young Hodges, had resigned abruptly following the state attorney's preliminary inquiry into the circumstances of the fraudulent filing. The recording was a quiet, administrative thing, Mary sitting across from the acting clerk and signing the paperwork while Seth stood at the window behind her, but it carried the weight of everything that had preceded it, and Mary signed her name with a steadiness and a completeness that felt like the closing of a long, grievous wound. Harlan Voss, in the weeks that followed, did indeed recalibrate. He did not come after Mary or Seth with any of the blunt, illegal instruments that his money made available to him, partly because Pell had taken his primary tool with him when he fled south, and partly because the state attorney's inquiry had cast a spotlight on Harlan Voss's operations in Harlan County that made direct action too costly even by Voss's calculus. He did not make any public statement or concession. Men like Voss rarely do. But he contracted slightly, his sphere of aggressive expansion pulling back along its edges in the way that any organism does when it has been hurt. Henry Pell was eventually found in New Mexico territory, working under a different name, and was returned to Texas to face charges. His subsequent testimony, offered in exchange for a reduced sentence, implicated Voss explicitly in the commission of the fraud, providing enough specificity and corroboration for the state attorney to bring charges against Voss directly. Those legal proceedings moved with the deliberate pace of formal justice, but they moved, and that was enough. Mary moved out to her father's property in October, once the fall had begun to soften the blistering Texas heat, and the cottonwoods along Callum Creek had started to turn. She cleaned the house thoroughly, repaired a section of the roof with help from a neighbor named Garrison who had known her father and who was quietly, gruffly pleased to see the property in Kendrick hands. She planted a kitchen garden for spring. She read her father's books in the evenings by lamplight and wrote long letters to her mother, who replied with a mixture of maternal anxiety and genuine pride that was one of Mary's mother's defining characteristics. Seth rode out on a Tuesday and a Thursday every week, and sometimes on Saturdays, on the pretext of no pretext at all, and they would sit on the porch in the cooling evenings and talk about everything under the sun. About Colorado and Missouri, about law and justice, and the grinding distance between those two concepts in frontier territories, about books and about the nature of landscape, about what they wanted and who they were and where they were going. He told her about his parents, both of them gone now, a mother from illness and a father from a riding accident, both when Seth was young enough to have carried the losses like something heavy and fundamental for a long time. He told her about Graves Creek, Colorado, which he had loved and which had broken something in him when the friend who brought him there had died, and the way that loving a place and losing it could make a person cautious about loving the next place too quickly. She listened and did not try to fix anything. She simply heard him, and when he was done she said, "You can love this place. It is not going anywhere and neither am I." He reached across the space between their chairs on the porch and took her hand, and they sat like that in the cooling Texas evening with the sound of Callum Creek barely audible through the cottonwoods. And Seth Abbott allowed himself, for perhaps the first time in many years, to feel entirely at home. He proposed to her in November, standing in the kitchen of the house on Callum Creek with his hat in his hands in the same way he had stood in the hallway of Mrs. Hollowell's boarding house, the first night they had met properly, and it was a real proposal, not contingent or hedged, not the beginning of a sentence he left incomplete. He told her he loved her. He told her she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in 33 years of encountering people, and he meant it without qualification. He told her he wanted to build something with her on this land that her father had built on honest ground, and he asked her, directly and clearly, to marry him. Mary Kendrick said yes without any pause at all. They married in January of 1883 in the small white church on the south end of Redemption's Main Street, in a ceremony attended by Mrs. Hollowell, who wept magnificently and productively throughout, by Garrison the neighbor, by Prentice from the Millhaven clerk's office, who had driven 18 miles in a borrowed buggy for the occasion, and by a dozen other residents of Harlan County who had watched the summer's events with interest and had arrived at a clear opinion about the matter. Mary wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from San Antonio, and that was exactly right for an early January afternoon in West Texas. And Seth wore his good coat and had shaved for the second time in their acquaintance and looked, Mary thought, like a man who could not quite believe how well things had turned out, which made two of them. Mary's mother, Elizabeth Kendrick, came down from Missouri for the wedding and stayed 3 weeks, and declared the Callum Creek property better than she had imagined from the letters, and Seth Abbott considerably better than she had dared to hope. The latter praise delivered in a whisper to Mary over the breakfast table, while Seth was outside with Garrison doing something practical with a fence. And the former praise delivered directly to Seth's face with a forthright certainty that made him go briefly and charmingly at a loss for words. Mary's mother returned to Missouri with a standing invitation to return whenever she pleased and a promise from her daughter to write monthly without fail. The spring of 1883 was everything the fall and winter had promised it might be. Mary's kitchen garden came up abundantly, a fact that gave her an unreasonable satisfaction out of all proportion to the scale of the achievement, but that was rooted in something larger than vegetables, in the act of making something grow on this land, in the continuation of the careful, stubborn, building impulse that her father had brought to this same ground 12 years before. Seth expanded the vegetable plot into a proper garden. He repaired the barn roof and built a small additional structure for additional livestock. He resigned his deputy's position in the spring, amicably and without drama, turning it over to a younger man whom he had been quietly training over the winter, and took up the work of the land with the same methodical, total commitment he brought to everything. In August of 1883, exactly 1 year after Mary had arrived in redemption with her father's papers, and a conviction that had been very nearly extinguished before Seth, Abbott stepped out of the shadow near the courthouse bulletin board and changed everything. Mary Kendrick Abbott told her husband that she was expecting their first child. Seth received this news standing at the kitchen table where they had worked on the federal submission a year before, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that she would remember for the rest of her life. The first brief moment of processing, then the slow, unstoppable arrival of something enormous and open, and completely unguarded, then the smile, that real, full, undisguised smile that she had first seen on the morning they learned they had won. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her and held her, and then he laughed, which was something she had not heard him do before, a quiet, warm, genuinely delighted sound, and she laughed too, and they stood together in the kitchen of her father's house with the August heat outside and the sound of Callum Creek through the open window and the whole great opened country around them. Their son was born in March of 1884, healthy and loud, and possessed from the first week of his life of a pair of thoughtful gray eyes that were unmistakably his father's, and a stubborn set to his chin that both parents recognized from a different direction. They named him Robert James Abbott, the first name for his grandfather who had built the house he would grow up in, and the middle name for Commissioner James Ackaffer, whose meticulous administration of federal law had made that house possible to keep. It was Seth who had suggested the middle name, quietly and seriously, and Mary had agreed with her whole heart. The legal proceedings against Harlan Voss concluded in the autumn of 1884 with a conviction on charges of fraud and conspiracy, and Voss, stripped of several of his land holdings and the political influence that had been inseparable from his financial dominance, retreated to a much reduced and significantly less predatory existence. The Harlan County that emerged from the disruption of his removal was not immediately transformed into a just and perfect place. The injustices of frontier Texas were not resolved by a single legal victory, but the machinery of unchecked power that had operated so smoothly for so long had been publicly and permanently jammed, and that mattered in ways that were not always visible but were always real. Mary continued to write to her mother every month as promised. Elizabeth Kendrick visited twice more over the following years. The second visit extended long enough for her to meet her grandson at 6 months old, and to sit on the porch of the Callum Creek house in the evening light with a cup of tea, and pronounce herself satisfied with the way things had gone, which from Elizabeth Kendrick was as close to an unqualified declaration of joy as the language offered. Mary also wrote a letter to Commissioner Ackaffer, a long, considered letter that was not merely a note of thanks but a substantive account of what the Federal Oversight Authority had meant in practical terms to one family in one corner of West Texas, what it had prevented, and what it had made possible. Ackaffer replied, which surprised her, in a letter of equal substance that expressed his own feelings about the nature of the work he did, and the importance of the people willing to fight for the integrity of their claims. They exchanged occasional letters over several years, and the correspondence gave Mary, who had grown up watching her father take the world seriously in his Shakespeare-quoting, careful-handed way, a sense of the connected, imperfect, stubbornly working machinery of a larger justice. Seth, in the years that followed on the Callum Creek land, became the man that Mary had seen him becoming from that very first morning at the courthouse, a man who had found, against his own cautious expectations, a place and a person that held him fully and that he held in return with everything he had. He was still quiet. He still noticed everything. He still moved through the world with that economy and deliberateness that had first caught her attention from across a dusty Main Street in August of 1882. But the guardedness had softened, worn away by the daily accumulation of a life that was genuinely his, and in its place was a steadiness that was entirely different in quality from the guardedness, open rather than closed, rooted rather than careful. Robert grew into a boy who had his grandfather's love of books and his father's love of careful observation, and his mother's absolute refusal to be deterred by anything that simply looked difficult, a combination that would serve him extremely well and would occasionally try the patience of the adults around him in deeply entertaining ways. In the spring of 1886, Mary had their second child, a girl they named Elizabeth Rose Abbott, after Mary's mother and after the wild roses that came up along the creek bank every year in extraordinary abundance, and that Mary had loved from her first spring at Callum Creek and had never gotten over loving. Elizabeth, from the very beginning, was a child of enormous personality and complete self-possession, and the combination of those qualities with the Abbott family tendency toward careful observation and the Kendrick family tendency toward absolute stubbornness produced a small person who was, as Seth put it one evening while she was negotiating loudly with Robert over the ownership of a stick, going to require a great deal of creative management. "She's exactly like you," he told Mary. "She's exactly like you," Mary said. They looked at each other over the evening table with the children's voices outside, and the creek running quiet beneath the cottonwoods and the great orange sky of a Texas sunset filling every window. And the look they exchanged was the look of two people who have built something real and lasting out of the materials of courage and principle and love, who have walked through betrayal and hidden motives and dark past, and a forced choice between surrender and fight, and who have come out the other side of all of it into something simple and extraordinary, a life that is genuinely their own on ground that no one will take from them again. The land of Callum Creek passed through time in the way of honest things. The house was extended twice over the years, a new room added when Robert needed his own space, and another when Elizabeth proved utterly unwilling to share the first additional room with her brother. The kitchen garden became something close to a small farm, managed with Mary's characteristic thoroughness and supplemented by Seth's characteristic precision. The cottonwood trees along the creek grew even larger, their shade spreading wider and deeper each summer, and the grass in the bottom of the basin stayed green later into the fall each year, as the careful land management of two people who took their stewardship seriously restored what years of uncertainty had depleted. On a morning in November, some years after that summer that had changed everything, Seth Abbott stood on the porch of the house he had helped to make his own and watched the sun come up over the flat brush country east of the creek basin, painting the sky in those particular western shades of rose and amber, and gold that never quite became routine no matter how many times you stood in front of them. And he thought about Charles Briggs and his meticulous stamp register, about a folded deed pressed into a woman's hand in a courthouse hallway, about the way the world sometimes bends toward justice if there is someone willing to apply enough patient pressure in exactly the right place. He heard the door behind him open and felt Mary come to stand beside him, and she handed him a cup of coffee and stood against his shoulder looking at the same sunrise. "Robert's already at his books," she said. "Elizabeth has informed us that she intends to help Garrison with the new fence today, by which she means she intends to follow him around telling him how she would do it differently." "She's not wrong about the post spacing," Seth said. Mary laughed, and the laugh was warm and uncontained, the laugh of a woman who was exactly where she meant to be, doing exactly what she had chosen to do, on land that was irrevocably and justly hers. "No," she said, "she's not." The Texas morning opened around them, wide and clear and full of the particular kind of light that turns ordinary things extraordinary, and Seth Abbott put his arm around his wife, and she leaned into him, and the creek ran quietly beyond the cottonwoods, and the house behind them held their children and their books and their father's Shakespeare, and the slow, continuous, daily evidence of what becomes possible when betrayal is answered with courage. When the forged and the fraudulent are challenged by someone willing to pay the cost of honesty, and when two people find each other in the middle of a fight worth having and decide, without reservation, that winning it together is only the beginning.